All right, well, I think I'll get us started here. I'm Michelle Maxwell, and I have the pleasure of joining you this afternoon as part of our future neurologic research program that we would have been together at the annual meeting, and we've divided up different topics and have had a program each month, and we thank you all for being a part of it. I also have the opportunity to introduce our facilitator for today, Dr. Brian Berman, is a professor of neurology at the Virginia Commonwealth University and chief of the movement disorder at VCU, as well as the director of VCU's Parkinson's and Movement Disorder Center. In addition to conducting neuroimaging research into the pathophysiology of Parkinson's disease and dystonia, he is a member of the AAN's Clinical Research Subcommittee and will be our facilitator today. Dr. Berman, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. So welcome everybody who's joined us already, and then hopefully we'll have some more people who come in here shortly. So this is the fourth installment of Futures in Neurology Research Program for this year. Overall, the goal of the program is really just to provide some sessions through the AAN that focus on promoting successful research strategies for medical students, residents, and fellows. Our overall learning objectives are to share pertinent resources regarding research with all of you and junior investigators, inspire new researchers to hopefully enter the field and in their research careers, and also a way to connect participants with experts and mentors in their field, as well as other peers who share similar interests. And normally the Futures in Neurologic Research is held at the annual meeting in person. Of course, not this year, but it's usually a half-day boot camp and luncheon get together. This year we're doing it virtually. We have, this is the fourth in the series. In August, we had a talk on getting your feet wet. And after that, a session on scientific writing, followed by last session in October, which was about finding funding sources and getting freedom in the research world. So there are slides and videos available to download for those. So please encourage you to look at them if you didn't get to attend one of those sessions. And so this one is going to be about recycling and persevering, important skills to have to be successful in a research career. And then next month's final session will be sort of more of a networking and celebration, and we invite you all to attend to that as well. Okay, so just some tips on this webinar. We will be muting all of the lines so that we don't hear the leaf blowers and the dogs barking and that type of thing. We have we want you to be involved, engaged, to ask questions and make this more interactive, which will happen toward after the talks. And so we request that you put in any questions that come up that you think about under the Q&A button there at the bottom, not the chat button, but the Q&A button. If you have technical problems, such as sound issues, things like that, you can put those into the chat and we can address them. And again, we'll be recording this webinar in case you would like to watch it again or tell your colleagues, friends about it. And then we ask that you please stay to the very end to complete the post webinar poll. That'll be a way to sort of help review this session. All right, and you heard about me. I'm really excited to introduce these other two who are really phenomenal. I have skills in getting rejection, getting my grant protected, but I think these two are just fantastic, amazing backgrounds and wealth of knowledge to share with you today. We're going to have Dr. Hinson, who talks about the nuts and bolts of grant writing, followed by Dr. Meyer, who will talk about, you get your proposal rejected, so now what, and how you do that. So the first speaker, I think I can introduce one at a time, will be Dr. Hinson. So she is an associate professor of neurocritical care, neurology, and emergency medicine at Oregon Health and Sciences University. She also serves as associate director of clinical research and neurosciences ICU at Oregon. is a member of the AAN Science Committee. She serves on the editorial boards of the journals Neurology, Stroke, and Neurocritical Care. So quite impressive. I don't know how she finds time for all this. She also has amazing work in what she identifies as computational neurology. This is a mouthful, but conducts research involving the development of precision strategies for the treatment of acute brain injuries by applying integrative approaches that include high-dimensional molecular and clinical data to infer predictive models of disease-related phenotypes. So really impressive background and work there. And I look forward to hearing this talk about the nuts and bolts of grant writing.
Well, thank you, Dr. Berman. That was really kind. And I promise the group I will not talk about coding whatsoever today. So you are spared. I promise. No machine learning, no coding, no endophenotyped discussion today. We're going to talk about grant writing. And so with that, we'll get started. So next slide, please. So I think the first thing, as we all have been in this situation of where in the world am I going to start to write a grant? It seems pretty intimidating, especially if you don't have a lot of experience, which I'm assuming for this particular audience, you're all in training still, or maybe just recently out of training. And so many of you really have not been exposed to grant writing at this stage in your career, or you've heard your faculty complain about it, or they're late to rounds because they were trying to get something submitted on time. I certainly remember that as a neurology resident. And so, so where the heck do you even start? Well, it all starts with an idea, just like any other research project. And it really helps to start to hone in specifically on what you want to work on, what you want to write about, what you want to do with your project, with really developing a good understanding of what's been done before. And a way, not the only way certainly, but one way that many folks get to that sense of what's been done before is to, for example, either formally write a review article or do a systematic review, or less formally, conducting literature searches under the supervision of of an attending mentor that's working with you. But the whole idea here is to really understand and develop a deep appreciation for what exactly is a good question. So what is a good question in the field that you're interested in digging into? And a parallel, really important concern that's related to what is actually a good question is your question. It might be the best question in the world and would revolutionize your field, but it might not be feasible. It might just be impossible to actually do. So for example, there's certain rare diseases where it would be absolutely impossible to do a randomized controlled trial because there just simply aren't enough subjects. And so, so what you're planning to do has to really involve a good, important question that moves the field forward that folks really care about versus something that's feasible. Another piece to the good question is it's important to keep in mind the pathophysiology of the disease state that you're studying. So for example, one of the hindrances back in past decades for stroke research was that in experimental paradigms, folks were giving neuroprotected agents prior to inducing a stroke in their animal models. And so that just doesn't really reflect the real world, right? There's no way we can identify folks out on the street and say, hey, you're going to have a stroke in the next 10 to 15 minutes. Here, let me administer this neuroprotectant. So all of these sorts of things are really important when you think about what's a good question, what's feasible. And then the next piece of this as well is, and this is a trap that many of us fall into, is that when you're first starting out, you sort of want to like answer all the questions with this first initial study, right? Like it's very easy to be too ambitious with the scope of the work that you'd like to achieve. And so it's incredibly important as you think about what question you'd like to pursue to consider how ambitious you are with this particular research project. It's very easy to bite off way more than you can chew for not only the time allotted to do this particular project, the patients that are available, or the models that you'll be using in the basic science laboratory, and then also the money and resources available. So sometimes those are just not sort of freely available. Unfortunately, we're oftentimes dealing in scenarios in which we're we have too little data, too little time, and too little money to do kind of everything we would really like to do. So narrowing your question and really honing down on one very specific piece, while it might not completely revolutionize the field and answer all the questions, might be really the right next iterative step to carry your field forward. So it's okay to have a bit of a more of a narrow scope, particularly when you're first starting off with your research career. So it would be pretty atypical for one to do, for example, a randomized control trial at this stage. The next consideration is, as you start to develop your question, is what exactly am I applying for? How would I know how much money or time I'll have? It really depends on the award that you're looking at. So the first piece is, what type of award is it? Is it an independent award versus a career development award? And I'm going to really tailor this talk towards career development awards because of the audience today. If you're considering writing an R, I would say this is probably not quite the right venue for you, and tread carefully. I think most of the folks in this audience are really thinking about career development awards at this stage. And the difference between those two are that for an independent award, you're the PI, you're leading the team, this is all sort of you, versus a career development award, you're still the PI, it's still your project, but it requires a mentor team that needs to be identified and a clearly defined mentorship plan. And that's really baked into the proposal itself. And so that's what we mean when we talk about quote unquote CDAs or career development awards. And those take many forms. So there's not just one available, fortunately. And there are different ones meant for folks at different stages in their career. So what sorts of granting agencies would give these career development awards? I think many of you are familiar with National Institutes of Health, and particularly the Institute NINDS, although certainly that's not the only institute that funds neurologists when they look to receive career development awards. Many of my colleagues are funded by many other agencies, NIA or Kennedy Shriver Institute, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not just NINDS, but they're a very common one. And then if you're thinking about NIH, generally the K series of awards are the career development awards that NIH offers. And those take a couple of different flavors. And so, for example, there's the K08, which is really aimed more at basic science work, versus a K23, which is a clinically patient-oriented research. And there are some overlap, of course, between those categories, but those are sort of general ones. Now, societies and institutions and even local groups will give awards as well. And so, for example, of course, the AAN offers a number of career development awards, both at sort of what used to be called the fellowship level, and then actually their own CDA, which is quite equivalent to the NIH's K award. And then additional to that, there are, as I mentioned, institutional K awards. And so instead of the federal government through NIH directly awarding the recipient, it actually goes to an institution that administers the award to someone there at that institution. There are also private foundations, such as a medical research foundation or disease-specific foundations. For example, the Brain Aneurysm Foundation offers career development awards. And so these are all different options, just depending on what you're studying and where you are in your career. So this is probably, it sounds on the face of it, the easiest. And I am here to tell you, this is actually the hardest to figure out. Is what is your goal? Where do you want to be after the completion of this career development award? And it sounds easy. It sounds like, okay, well, I just want to have the answer to my scientific question. But really the point of career development awards, yes, is of course to fund a research project, but more importantly, it's to fund the education and skill development of the recipient of that award. And so the truly, and this is hard to completely wrap your brain around, but the true purpose is to administer career development. And that is the most important piece. And so that piece really needs to be delineated very well in your application, even I wouldn't say more than, or it's more important, but it really should be the focus of where you start when you start to develop a career development award over the mentors in the project. A lot of times folks will think of like, oh, I have this really cool project, and scramble to identify somebody who would maybe consider mentoring me in this, and oh, I guess I'll just take a couple of biostats classes and it's cool, that's a career development award. And that approach is less likely to be successful than the one that is really like deeply thought out of, I want to develop, and you don't have to want this, but like computational skills. And thus I'm going to choose mentors that can help mentor me in that area. And then developing a project that makes sense with that career goal. So I would encourage all of you all to think deeply about what skills you want to develop during your career development award. And so once you have that goal in mind, how do you get there? What is necessary between your training up until that point and then becoming that thing, that goal, that place that you want it to be at? And that's what you need to map out. And so oftentimes it's easy to think about this as structured coursework. So taking, for example, I mentioned the biostats classes, maybe in the School of Public Health, and that's certainly an option. I'm not trying to dissuade you. I think the world could benefit if all of us took like hardcore statistics. But at the same time, it doesn't have to look like that. It doesn't have to look like formal coursework. It can be less formal one-on-one mentorship with your mentor, doing a series of guided readings, for example, on a particular topic. It could be visiting a specific lab and job shadowing with a specific scientist to gain perspective about the pitfalls of a particular technique. So you can get quite creative with that pathway. It just really needs to contribute to where you're hoping to go with your particular skill set development in order to get you to a place where you're going to be able to competitively compete for that next independent award. Next slide. And so this is I'll try not to get too much on my soapbox about this, but this is something that I'm really passionate about, which is mentorship. It really matters. It absolutely matters. And finding a mentor is not as straightforward often as it sometimes seems. But, and I know this will seem advanced for where you are in your careers, but becoming a mentor is a fabulous thing. And they've actually studied this carefully and seen that it relates to higher job satisfaction and better self-esteem and organizational buy-in, all these kind of wonderful things. And so I'm sure you're sitting there thinking, well, I'm a medical student. How can I be a mentor? You can be a mentor at any stage of your career. And in fact, within my lab, I have a number of medical students that I supervise their scholarly projects, and I pair them with undergraduate students, and they're actually teaching them how to do literature searches and just the most fundamental basics of clinical research, since that's what we do as a clinical traumatic brain injury lab. So, so you can be a mentor at any stage in your career, and I encourage you to start thinking about yourself in that role and start practicing, because you're going to be a mentor throughout your entire career, and it's an important skill set to have. Next slide. So how the heck do you find a mentor? Well, look around your institution and see who has mentored others. That's really important. Talk to their previous mentees or their current mentees. What is it like to work with this person? How have those mentees done with becoming successful? Have they been publishing? Have they been presenting at conferences? Have they been successfully competing for grants? What have they done after graduating from the lab and going off on their own? Have they been successful in their scientific careers, or have they left science, right? Hopefully that's not the case, but you know, it's just important to sort of see like what is this person's track record and how have they done and how have previous relationships gone. And it could be that one of the people on your mentor team really doesn't have a lot of experience, and that is okay, but that can't be your only person in your mentor team. So you need at least one experienced person who has walked someone else down the road that you're hoping to go down. Next slide. So on that topic, one mentor is rarely enough, particularly in this day of age with the complexity of science and then also the tenets of team science. We really make so much more progress in groups than we do individually. I think gone are the days in which, you know, you have sort of this stereotypical scientist like locked in their lab, independently working, making these giant breakthroughs. That's just rarely the case anymore. We really work together in communities. And so think of finding mentors as a team approach. And not every single person will have all the characteristics or qualities that you will need in a mentor. Likely you will create an aggregate, sort of your perfect mentor out of your team of mentors, because it's atypical that one person would possess all these characteristics anymore. But the things I think about, and when I recommend to students and trainees what to do is, you have to have at least one person with bandwidth that has time for you, that's absolutely going to be able to read every line of the grant that you're working on. And I'm not kidding. I mean, line for line, and even do spelling and grammar and wordsmithing to every bit of that application. If you're the only person that's read the whole grant, that's a problem. That's not going to go well because you'll be blind to certain things. They'll be quite obvious to other people. The next is topical expertise. So someone on your team needs to know something about what the heck you're studying. Otherwise, how are you going to become an expert in this area? Presumably you need this career development to take the next step, and they need to be able to tell you about the pitfalls of the field, and also to tell you what journals to think about publishing in, what conferences are important to attend, to present your work at. All of these things are essential. And then finally, you need at least one person on your team that has a track record of success. They've had other mentees that have gone the path that you hope to do. And so specifically for many of us that have K awards are thinking, okay, at the conclusion or near the conclusion of my K, I'll be applying for my own independent R grant. Has this mentor taken someone successfully through their K to the R, and they've achieved that R and are now an independent scientist? And so at least somebody has done that. Now, does that person have the bandwidth for all of their students? Maybe not, but they need to at least be on the team to give you that kind of guidance. When you start working with your mentor, these are some pro tips that I've assembled over the years, having been a mentee and a mentor many, many times over. The first is really be mindful of your mentor's time. They are busy people. You've chosen someone successful and wonderful, and they don't have like a lot of extra time. So come to them with an agenda. This ensures that you get your questions answered, and that you make progress and get through what you need from them, and you don't leave the meeting thinking, oh crap, I have 50 things that we were supposed to talk about. We just sort of talked about the weather or politics. So don't do that. The next is figure out their communication style. I have one of my dearest mentors who does not respond to email, ever, never, does not respond to email. So I know that about this person, and I text them when I really need them, and that's fine. And we set up phone calls, but that is just working with this person. That is part and parcel with it, and I accept it, and it's not a problem. But that would really frustrate someone else. Prepare for the meetings in advance, read up on topics. Don't sort of show up like a deer in the headlights and like have no idea kind of what's going on or what you want to talk about. And then also to be responsive and take feedback gracefully. You're asking this person to make time for you out of their busy schedule. And so they're going to have critiques. And in fact, that's what you want from them. You want their expertise. And so getting defensive and telling them how they're wrong or silly about what their suggestions are is not going to really ingratiate you with your mentor, and might really not lead to too productive of a relationship. So be graceful, be thankful. The next piece is the project itself, right? And so the project, even though it seems like it would be the most important thing, actually isn't. I mean, it is important, of course, spend lots of time, carefully choose, but it needs to be couched sort of on all this career development piece that I was mentioning. But the project itself really needs to make sense for what you do. And also something that I would strongly recommend is to consider your institutional strengths. An example of this is that I'm a traumatic brain injury researcher. It wouldn't make any sense for me to go off to an institution that is not a level 1 trauma center and then try to study TBI, because there aren't the patients coming there. So that wouldn't be a good match. And so considering, what is your institute strong in? What are you weaker in? How does your project fit into that is really, really important. Your project really should work because of your institution, not in spite of it. So grant writing and science in general is challenging enough, and you don't need extra challenges that you could have avoided by being sort of thoughtful about your project. And so really take a look at your institution overall. Another piece that hooks into the mentorship piece is that only one of my 5-person mentor team for my K is a neurologist, actually. The rest are not in neurology at all, nor are they neurosurgeons or anesthesiologists, as you might expect for a neurointensivist. I have 2 folks in the cancer center, and that's because my institution's very strong in cancer, and that's where the smart people were. So not to diminish anyone else in my institution, it's just those mentors were particularly strong for my particular project. So next slide. The crux of any project is going to be a specific aims page. And this is probably the portion of the grant that we think most deeply about and really workshop the most. And every single word really has to be the right one. When you write, I think it's easy, particularly when you're a junior person, to think everybody knows more than I do. And of course, this panel of reviewer experts are going to know everything about my topic. And so they're just going to know all these acronyms. Careful with that. Really think about teaching in your grant. You want to start on that Aims page quite early and share widely. And then as you get closer to the grant deadline, then you need to pull it in terms of the folks that you show it to, because you might get conflicting feedback about what to do. And so there has to be a way for you to figure out whose advice to take and whose to sort of deprioritize. So that's challenging. Next slide. In terms of the approach, this is the scientific approach. You really want to understand the purpose of each section. One of the sort of novice, and I've fallen into this trap myself, mistakes that folks make is not really understand what particular sections are supposed to be and just sort of write the same thing over and over again in different words. And that's not helpful. Each grant is really quite short and you don't have that much space. And so you shouldn't be repeating a bunch of stuff. In fact, not very much repetition at all. I think one section that's overlooked is the pitfalls and alternative approaches. And this is your area to show that you really understand the topic quite well and that you understand the limitations of your technique. And so this is where you should anticipate some of the challenges of your particular scientific approach and say what you'll do if things don't work exactly as you anticipate. So that's a key section to really understand. Also, too, figures can save space and very efficiently communicate ideas and condense long text paragraphs. So that can be quite helpful. Next slide. Other parts of the application, just briefly, you want really high quality figures. And so a high quality figure leaves a better impression. Cheesy clip art is not great. Consider tables and flowcharts, particularly in the career development plan. You definitely want to follow all the formatting rules. And you want to look at other successful grants, but realize that those grants are written by other people. And so it's not going to be an fallible template to show you exactly what to do. What works for one investigator won't work for the next. And so don't adhere to another successfully funded grant as if like sort of as, you know, the word from on high. That's not the case. Next slide. You want to warn folks in your department that you are working on a career development award. And so letting your chair know, your division director early, so they know how to, for example, staff the ICU when you aren't going to be doing weeks there, these types of things. It's really important to let folks know what your ambitions are. And so they can sort of flex and plan around what you're thinking about. And also to write those letters and make really great letters early on that are very detailed and really support your application. So that's key. Don't let them know kind of like 2 weeks before the deadline, oh, hey, I need a chair letter. That's not great either. And then also too, you'll have to strategize about identifying folks that can write referee letters and consultant letters. And so those are important as well. And so I think next slide, I think I'm at the end. And so most importantly, submit. You're not going to get the grant that you don't apply for. So definitely go for it. Also, another word to the wise, internal deadlines at your institution likely are a couple of weeks before the posted, for example, NIH deadlines. And so work with your grants admin folks to know when those are and get things to the grant admin people enough in advance and where your application will go in without an issue, not the night before. And most importantly, persistent pays off. So, so don't get discouraged. And so that goes right into the next talk. I just wanted to say that I put my Twitter handle on the slide, and so please feel free to follow me there and to also ask questions if you don't get your questions answered today. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the team.
All right, thank you. That's great. Well, so much, lots of good material there for folks. And I do want to just reiterate for those who maybe joined a little bit late that for any questions or for our speakers or just for the group in general, please put them into the Q&A, the button down at the bottom there. Just enter in the questions, and at the end of the next talk, we'll be opening it up for more discussion and answering questions. So the next one is going to be about what to do after the proposal's rejected, which is something that we all have faced, and I don't think anyone out there who hasn't faced this. So Dr. Meyer is a senior clinical advisor to the principal assistant for acquisition for the U.S. Army Medical Research and Development Command. So we're fortunate to have her give a talk. She is also an adjunct assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University. And in her role at this USA MRMZ, which it's probably easier to say, that she oversees the advanced development of medical products from late stage FDA regulated clinical trials to licensure, and then the follow-on initial production and fielding to ultimate users. So an important job. And for example, one of the commands to a diverse line right now includes vaccines, and which is very relevant. And so if she has to go urgently, we know what's going on during the talk. Pharmaceuticals and medical devices and information technology. But before she joined the USA MRMC, she was on faculty at Yale, and before that at University of California, San Francisco, where I trained, where she left, or she started just after I left there. And then she spent 7 years in Kenya conducting research focused on HIV-associated neurocognitive disorders and the prevention of cryptococcal meningitis neurocysticercosis. So it's a really impressive background, really excited to hear her presentation. And if any questions come up, please put them into the Q&A. All right, thanks, Dr. Meyer.
Great. Well, good evening, everyone. And I feel a little bit guilty giving this talk because technically I've gone over to the dark side of the funders' perspective. So, but before I was on this side, I was, a PI and applied for my own career development award. So it's a topic near and dear to my heart. So I wanted to start just by saying rejection hurts. And you know what? We are a real type A group of individuals. We all excelled in undergraduate. We went to medical school, we went to residency, and we're not used to rejection, especially in the professional sphere. So I think, the first thing to do is just say those feelings are there. And I mean, these are kinds of things that I personally have felt when getting rejected by a grant funder, and things that colleagues have said to me when they get their rejections. Everyone will kind of have their own feeling. And the first question I think everybody asks themselves after they get their first grant rejected is, should I just quit research for good? I'm no good. It's like the Muppet that bangs their head on the piano, I'll never get it. But that's not the case. Next slide. So rejection is just a normal part of grant writing. And you saw Dr. Hinson, Dr. Berman vigorously shaking their heads that yes, we've all been rejected. So when you get rejected, just know you are not alone. NIH grant success rates were 20% in 2018. And that's kind of the last year they have full data available. And the pay lines, which are basically percentile scores of which grants get funded, range from 10 to 20%, depending on which center at NIH. So it's a very competitive environment. That doesn't mean you're not going to get funded. And I think before you feel despondent, ask any funded researcher what percent of their grants get funded. They may not want to actually tell you because it's slightly terrifying when you look at it, but it's well under, I would say, 50% for any funded researcher. And I would say most people, it's probably 25 to 30% of your grants get funded. So what do you do next? So I think I put the 5 stages of grief for research grant rejection because I think they're just really critical. We all go through these: the denial, bargaining, depression, and then just the hate you want to give to your reviewers because they've trashed your perfect, gorgeous idea. All that is there. Take time, get through all that, and then figure out what's next. So the first place, if you apply to, an award where you get summary statements, take some time to digest those summary statements and come at it, I think, with the attitude that Dr. Hinson, kind of highlighted in her talk, which is take that feedback as love. That's the red pen. Those reviewers take time. And for any of us who, once you've served on a study section or you've reviewed grants, I think most people who review grants really put their best effort to providing good feedback, because none of us do reviews, right? We don't get paid. It's just a big time sink. People do it because they care. They do it because they want to see science move forward. So every once in a while you'll get a grumpy reviewer. I'll definitely say I've had one or two in there, but most people really put those comments with your best interests and with the best interests of science in mind. So really take time to look at them, and don't just look at them alone. Look at them with your trusted mentors. And Dr. Hinson kind of pointed out the importance of mentorship. This is one of the times that you call on those folks to help you understand, the summary statements. If you don't get a summary statement, talk to the program officer for that award and see if they can give you any information about concerns that were raised about the award, or any comments they might have. And then really you get to your decision. So I think of this as kind of 3 different options, with one that's just there for fun, but you either revise and resubmit, you repurpose, or you pivot. And I'll talk through kind of how you make that decision and what those mean. And personally, sometimes you just want to move to a tropical island. So just a word about program officers. I think in general, particularly folks that are junior, people are really afraid to talk to program officers. And I use that term broadly. That's the term is used at NIH. We have slightly different terms in DoD, but any grant making agency will have an officer who's charged with running the application process. Now, their goal is really to fund the best science and accomplish the organization's mission. Generally, people go into that because they're just mostly nice people. They love science, and most of them really enjoy mentoring. So go into your conversation thinking that. Don't be afraid. There are things you can and cannot ask a program officer. So what can you ask? You can ask their interpretation of the level of enthusiasm for your project. You can ask if your project aligns with the organization's mission. You can ask them if they felt the criticisms of your grant included any kind of deal-breaking flaws, because that may or may not come out in your summary statement. Sometimes you'll get contradictory statements in a summary statement. So you can ask them how they might interpret things that are contradictory. For NIH in particular, you can ask if they felt this was the right study section or grant type for your project. And if you had kind of a high or borderline score, you can sometimes ask if you might be eligible for special funding. What special funding is for those of you who have forgotten everything you ever knew about civics, our budget is decided each year by Congress. And they get a certain amount of money that they get to spend. They have to spend that through the whole year. At the end of the year, if there are leftover funds that haven't been allocated to a grant, often both at DoD and NIH and any government agency, they'll fund grants at the end of the year that might have been borderline, that they might not have funded earlier. So you can ask, particularly if you have a borderline score, if you'd be eligible for that. Next slide. Okay. So when you start looking at your summary statement, I kind of divide things into 3 groups. The first one is minor to major fixable problems. So some of these are things that Dr. Hinson went over: poor writing, formatting, or presentation. If it's not your strength, get help. Get it from an English major, get it from a poli-sci person, because if they can't understand, the narrative thread of your grant, probably nobody can. Honestly, I used to have my mom read my specific aims page, because she was great. She would just say, what is blah, blah, blah. And, she's not a scientist at all, but she's an excellent writer. And she would ask me really good questions. And if I figured if I couldn't communicate my idea to her, I wasn't going to communicate it to a larger review panel. Another issue is your significance isn't convincing. Make sure that when you put your project forward, you're aligning it to your funder's mission and health. And if you don't know what that is, not health, obviously all of us are physicians, but if you don't know what your funder's mission is, you're probably not going to write a successful grant. Another issue is the reviewers may not have understood your project, and that may be your writing. And so again, take that red pen and think that through carefully, or it may be their knowledge base. And so again, remember, you can't just put a bunch of technical jargon out there and assume people understand. You really have to teach your project as much as you're requesting funding. It may be that your research isn't feasible due to lack of expertise in your own or in your mentorship group, or the scope of your project is just too big for that award. Other issues may be there isn't enough information on the experimental details or the preliminary data, or you don't kind of present a convincing discussion of potential obstacles or alternative approaches that you may need to take. Next slide. Now, there are some problems that are not fixable. One of them is a low impact topic, reviewers not being enthusiastic, and major conceptual issues. And hopefully if you've had, a senior mentor review your grant, you're not going to have one of the major conceptual issues. Those are the hypothesis isn't sound, your hypothesis isn't supported by your data or your methods, the work is really repetitive, or the methods you're proposing aren't suitable to answer the question. And that should be sorted out. If one of those are the issues, you really need to make sure the mentors that are looking at your grant before it goes in have the necessary expertise. Kind of the bewares are if you get kind of faint praise for your grant, but not a very good score, that's often a sign of limited reviewer enthusiasm. If you get a low significance score, but there's really minimal criticism, that's also kind of a sign that you may have a topic that that particular review group or that funding agency felt was kind of a low impact. Next slide. So how do you decide? So really, I kind of think of this as, is the problem fixable? If the answer is yes, and it's kind of a minor issue, absolutely revise and resubmit, no question. If it's a major issue, typically I would repurpose, and we'll talk about what that means. In some cases, you can also revise and resubmit. And if the problem really isn't fixable, you can either repurpose or pivot. And again, I'll talk about what I mean about those. Next slide. So revise and resubmit. This is probably the most common. When you revise and resubmit your grant, you want to make sure you address the reviewer's points one by one. Often there is an opportunity to summarize those changes in an introduction. Keep in mind that this may be going to a new set of reviewers. So you need to make sure that you address the reviewer's concern in a way that somebody new to this grant could understand. Include any new preliminary data, your own improvements, additional collaborators, changes or refinement of your methods, fixing up your writing and those typos. Make sure you use updated forms. And I think the key thing is be respectful, even if you completely disagree with your reviewer. Put it nicely. Next slide. Okay, and then there's repurposing. Repurposing is looking at your grant and picking out the strongest part of your application and use that as a foundation of a new project. And it may be narrowing your focus, or it may be major changes. So you may have the right problem, but the wrong methods or approach, the wrong patient population or model. You might have the right methods, but kind of an overly complex problem or a problem of limited significance. You may have omitted or overlooked a key confounder, or you may be trying to do too much with the money you have available to you, and you just need to kind of narrow the whole project down. Next slide. And the last one is pivot. And sometimes what you are passionate about, you may be too early, honestly, for where research is at. So sometimes you have to make a more radical change in your methods or approach in your patient population or in your model. You may need to change around your mentorship team. It may be that kind of their focus is not something that is currently exciting to other scientists. Other things you can do is learn new skills. So I think some of Dr. Hinson's points, like go to someone else's lab, have somebody, who's got quite different perspective, look at what you're doing and give you some new ideas. And use this really as an opportunity to network, engage, and talk to other scientists about what you're doing. And it may be that you need to develop new methods to address the problem that you're looking at. All right, next slide. So in summary, I put some resources here, and I'm not sure how we can share these slides. There are some great resources from NIAID talking about how to think through revising and resubmitting. There's a great Nature article on the same. And please remember, I think any scientist who has gotten a funded award, finished a funded project, and kind of made it to the next hurdle, it's because we persevered and we tried and tried again. So thanks very much, and looking forward to your questions.
Perfect. Yes, thanks. So the slides and a video of this webinar will be available afterwards. And so good. So we have gotten some questions and kind of hit maybe the first one, I guess. It was a question that was asking about the concept of mentoring it and mentoring in other continents, I guess, outside the US. And the questioner raised the idea that does it make sense to have your mentor in the US while you're outside? So I guess maybe could maybe Dr. Hinson could talk about the mentors that are distant mentors. This happens in the US as well. Say they're on the other side of the country, or balancing
Yes.
long distance mentors.
And in the era of COVID, all mentoring is long distance, right? I mean, we're really to the point where we're meeting over Zoom sort of across town. So, so I feel like it's never been more feasible than now to have distant mentors. I can say for me, I have a number of local mentors, but two of my mentors are distant. So they're on the East Coast and I'm on the West Coast. And so that's, quite a bit of distance. So I think it's absolutely appropriate. You just need to show at what frequency you're planning to meet with these folks. And so, for example, in my K Award, I laid out a very careful plan about the frequency of meetings, how they would take place, the content, just so you're very concrete about what your plans are. I think it absolutely works and it's absolutely fine. I think everyone is really indoctrinated into the idea that we can use video calling pretty effectively these days. So I'll wonder if Dr. Meyer has something to add.
Yeah, I want to absolutely echo what Dr. Hinson had to say. I mean, my career was really in global health up until this point, and so my mentorship team was scattered around the world, as was I. And I've both been mentored and mentored folks around the world. I still have mentees in East Africa who are conducting research and continuing their careers. And so it's possible. It does take more commitment and dedication. And I would say as the mentee, the onus is really on you to chase that mentor down. They're probably not ignoring you because they don't like you. They're probably ignoring you because they're juggling about 1,500 other things. So I think please make sure to just follow up and take the initiative.
Yeah, those are good points. Mentoring in the time of COVID is really, we've seen some great changes. Hopefully will continue. So good. There's a question about from an international medical graduate about visa requirements. And I'm not sure if we should comment on that, or that might be something I would suggest contacting a program officer who can also point you to which, at least for the NIH funded grants, and maybe Dr. Meyer, you could talk about the DoD for the visa requirements for various grants that are out there. Is there someone to contact? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, first off, there's no substitute for contacting your program officer or the administrator of the grant to ensure that you meet all the criteria. And so there's sort of no way that I could possibly, or any of us could answer for every single opportunity you're considering what you would be applicable for, versus what you would not. At one time, there was a citizenship requirement for the K series at NIH. So that's something to pay attention to. That generally is not the case with foundation awards, but again, it's really based on each individual group's laws and restrictions. And so anytime you're considering applying for something, very early, look through the eligibility criteria and ensure you meet each and don't have any exclusions. So that's incredibly key.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I don't think I could comment just because of the great diversity of awards that we have at DoD and that NIH has. There is a career development award through the Fogarty International Center, specifically for international researchers. That does require you to stay in your home country, though, not do research here in the US. You can come here for education and training, but it's really to help develop researchers who plan to stay in their home country. So that's the one career development award through NIH that I'm familiar with that does take non-US citizens.
Great. And then, so we have another question, and this is kind of the catch-22 question, I think. So when you're trying to get a project going and it's totally dependent on having funds to initiate the data collection, how can you provide preliminary results or data in the grant application? So I guess you want to take that, Dr. Hinson?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all find ourselves in this scenario in which we feel like we almost have to do the project to apply to get the money to do the project. And so you're definitely in this vicious cycle of, well, how can I get experience if I need experience to apply, right? Sort of like that classic job thing. This is where you need to lean on your mentors. And so it could be that your mentor has some data in a slightly different patient population, or as part of a different project, or certainly a slightly different context than the one you're intent on studying. So it might be that it's just not possible to get those funds, and that you can extrapolate from another data source, and do ask your mentors. If that's unavailable, if that's just not going to be an option for you, another option is to ask for institutional awards. And so oftentimes universities will have very small sort of pilot spark awards that are not a lot of money, but can at least get you the preliminary data that then will accelerate your ability to apply for awards. So I'll speak about my home institution of OHSU. There's something called the Medical Research Foundation of Oregon that does exactly this. It offers these sort of smaller pilot grants. There are even things like the Dean's Innovation Fund that offers kind of these small little chunks to at least get you started, so you can show feasibility and then make a better case that you can conduct the award at your institution.
Yeah, great. Good. So another question that came in was about applying for multiple grants while you're waiting for the outcomes of one of your applications. Either one, feel free to answer.
I would say yes. This is absolutely an important strategy. Actually, I'd encourage you to do so. It's a wonderful problem to have to surrender one award to get another. I did that once, and it was really exciting. So yeah, it's absolutely acceptable. Now, do be careful that you're not submitting the identical thing to multiple different places for the, sort of the identical, slightly variations in projects, I think, are encouraged, again, depending on what awards you're applying for. But yeah, that's absolutely acceptable.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think from the funder side, what we can't do is fund the same research twice. And so I think part of kind of grants personship, and this is where your mentors can help you, is to separate, as you're applying for different awards, things into complementary chunks so that you can leverage them to support kind of one greater project, so that if you do get funded, you can keep both of the awards. And I kind of worked with my mentor in a certain point in my career, and I did end up getting 2 awards, which was awesome. It never happened again, by the way. But I ended up being able to keep those 2 awards because of the way that I wrote them, so that they were complementary rather than duplicative. And then I was able to keep both awards. So that's just kind of the strategy, and your mentors can help you guide how to structure that, so you don't end up with 2 awards that overlap.
I pray that you have that problem. It's a great issue to find yourself dealing with.
Definitely a good problem to have. All right, if anyone else wants to provide a question, please enter it in. I was going to ask one. Maybe, I guess this comes up a lot, especially in mentoring, that people in the early careers feel like you do get conflicting feedback. I think Dr. Hinson, you mentioned this before. I guess you might have 2 mentors, and they sort of start dueling in terms of how something should be presented or the question that should be asked. Do you have some suggestions about how to handle that?
Oh my gosh, this has absolutely happened to me, and it's happened to my mentees who were 2 of their other mentors, not myself, completely disagreed on how to address an issue and gave completely conflicting feedback. So that's really difficult. It's either, there are a couple of different strategies. There's not one that's going to work for everybody, but let me throw a few out there, and you'll just see kind of what works for you and your project. So one is to designate a primary mentor who will be the final say, the final adjudicator, the person that's going to really make the decision. And so you just say, okay, Dr. X is going to be the person that makes the final decision because they're my primary mentor. That's one strategy. Another strategy, I have co-primary mentors, and so they have essentially equal footing in the project. And so what we came up with for my K was a way in which to address conflict, actually formally. Now it's never happened. They actually agree on like everything, which is great. But we have a formal process that we sort of laid out in the application to address that, because of the fear of having 2 co-primary mentors that would perhaps disagree. If you're in a less formal scenario in which you're just sort of showing your aims around, and two of your mentors say this, but then someone you really respect who's maybe actually even not a mentor is like, oh my God, what are you doing? No, this is a terrible idea. Then at the end of the day, sometimes you really just have to listen to your gut and figure out what the right direction is and sort of own that, because there's not a single project, I think, that's going to be unassailable to any set of eyes. And so gaining the confidence and the skills sort of over time to say, okay, well, perhaps this isn't the right strategy in every scenario, but this is the one I'm going to stick to, and this is the direction we're going. It takes some gumption, but one does develop that over time to kind of listen to one's gut. But that's challenging, particularly as a medical student or resident. That's tough. That's definitely tough.
Good. And then maybe a question for Dr. Meyer. So if someone has a K grant and they get their statement and it seems encouraging enough and they feel they're responding to the critiques and resubmit, and then the scores are lower or it gets tabled, that is at the second stage. I won't say that's happened to me, of course it has, but what would you suggest to that person then after that submission? Should they start to pivot at that point? Go back and look at how they responded to the comments, because maybe it was sort of, was faint praise. And so, you have any suggestions for someone whose project then gets worse after responding?
So that definitely happens. And I think I guess I should confess it's even happened to me. So I think it's happened to all of us at one point or another in our careers, where you submit it, you revise, you address all the reviewers' comments, and it comes back with a lower score. And that sucks. I'll just say that right off the bat. Just stinks. And that's usually when you want to start thinking about either repurposing or pivoting your project. I think the challenge with K awards in particular is that they are supposed to kind of divide it evenly between, scoring the development of the career and scoring the science. I would say it tends to be, and this is just my personal experience, this is not an official position of NIH, and DoD does not fund career awards, but I think, when I saw kind of my own summary statements for my K award, it was much more focused on the science and not on your career development. So one may be that nobody wants to say anything mean about you as a person or your career development plan. Often that's a weakness though. And so making sure that your career development plan is really solid and is going to take you through a logical process to where someone can see that you're going to become independent at some point. That's often a weakness that people won't comment on, but lends itself to lower scores. The other piece is you may want at that point to talk to your program officer to find out kind of, maybe they may not be willing to tell you what the weakest part of your grant is, but what the strongest part of your grant was and what people were most enthusiastic about, and kind of pull that out and work on that piece of it and expand that. And then the other piece is to, give it to uninterested people in your own institution. Most institutions will have kind of a coordinated group that helps people develop and apply for their first career development award. It depends on your institution. Ask around, see if that kind of group exists, and give your grant to somebody who has no vested interest in you or in the research topic. And they can usually read the summary statements and really help you figure out where those weaknesses are. Because sometimes reviewers also, because we're generally nice people, don't want to say things that are too mean. And so they kind of dance around an issue that they don't necessarily want to come right out and say, which is that you're, I don't know, spending 3 years doing biostatistics is dumb, right? And so not that I hate biostatistics, and, you're really not looking, at your plan more holistically. So I think getting that external objective feedback from someone who isn't your mentor can be critical.
Right.
I just want to echo that, because that actually happened. That happened to me. So I very much lived through that. And one thing that was really helpful to me was that I so through the assistance of some unrelated folks in the field who were not actually involved in my project at all, I was connected with someone who had a topical expertise that wasn't going to be my mentor, but was able to read through the summary statement with me and to point out what was coded in that summary statement, what they were actually really bothered by, that was invisible to my mentor team because they were sort of too close to the project and too invested and too angry about the feedback to even really sort of see what to read between the lines, if you will, to understand what the issue was. And so that's how we solved it, and then it was successful.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. So before anybody gets off, the participants, we've asked that you please stay on for just real briefly. We're going to have a exit evaluation. Please fill that out. Dr. Hinson, Dr. Meyer, thank you so much. That was great stuff. Amazing you continue to learn as you hear others speak, and I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone who joined.